Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Sean King. Now, Sean is a Senior Vice President at Park Strategies, a business advisory firm, and also an affiliated scholar at the University of Notre Dame's Lau Institute for Asia and Asian Affairs, and his previous roles include that within the United States Department of Commerce as a Senior Advisor for the Asian region. And so for today's topic, on the Hanoi Summit, the previous Singapore Summit, and the overall view of this type of diplomacy and its benefits and its downsides, Sean is incredibly well placed. It is hard to look at what happened in Hanoi without looking at the broader picture, without winding things first back to Singapore. How we got there, what the benefits were, what the outcomes became, why both parties, who in many ways come at this from such different directions with such different goals, saw something in Singapore that they thought could be repeated in Hanoi and produce for them a long-term strategic victory. And though it was often reported as being an empty summit, this first one in Singapore, as Sean will detail, there was a whole series of detailed things that did come out of this, that tended to, quite inexplicably, sail past most people's minds. Simply by the nature of the summit itself, it dealt with the long-standing issue of sidelining South Korea. It spoke openly about the need for a peace regime. With it were the apparent concessions from both sides of the repatriation of American servicemen remains from the Korean War, and Trump's seemingly impulsive stance that he was going to call a halt to South Korean American military exercises. But throughout this, there was also an issue that seemed to bubble up to the fore. That is, the disparate understandings of what denuclearisation actually means. Now, with this grounding in place, with this understanding of what happened at the summit, we move forward to talk about Trump and the American administration as it is currently constituted. Because whether you support the current president's initiative or not, it is beyond doubt that Kim Jong-un is seeing something in Trump that he hasn't seen in other leaders. He's responding to his policies differently, and he has been incredibly more willing to at least talk about concessions, talk about peace, and even within their own media offer excuses for him for the breakdown of the summit, tending to blame those below him, Pompeo and John Bolton instead. And of course this becomes the picture for the Hanoi Summit. Both parties walking in believing they were going to get something out of it, some sort of tangible gain for their side. And then both parties walking away early, disappointed. So we will talk through what happened here. The economic landscape of all this, the opportunity for reform, whether the much vaunted Vietnam model actually works here, what role sanctions should hold, and whether sanctions relief should be offered at this stage. And then importantly, the question of South Korea, because in many ways they have been pushing ahead with low-level confederation, with agreements and cooperation, and tying their two countries together, without waiting for the denuclearization talks to continue on pace. For the South Koreans, this seems to be not an exercise so much in removing the nuclear weapons, as an opportunity to move towards reunification, regardless of the nature of North Korea's military. And this is where the discussion with Sean becomes so important, because he recognizes a fact about North Korea and South Korea that scholars have been talking about over the years, but has often been quietened down and hushed away. It's one of those uncomfortable issues that people don't want to recognize despite just how unavoidably certain it is. And that is the nature of the North Korean regime as a military-first, ethnocentric country, one that holds its legitimacy through a claim to race-based nationalism and race-based universal superiority. It has echoes of Nazi Germany in this way, and most of all, huge import for South Korea, because the North Korean claim to race-based nationalism includes them, and it is the driving force behind the North Korean claim to want to reunify the peninsula still. And this wouldn't be so alarming in and of itself if South Korea didn't harbour similar thoughts. Not quite as fervent, not quite as militaristic, not quite bubbling to the fore in everyday life, but still an ideology undercutting things, mentioned openly in public by leaders such as Moon Jae-in, about the importance of reunifying the race. And so with this, a signal goes to the North. A signal that both countries are on the same page, are still brothers, and therefore everything is forgivable, because reunification of the race is all that matters. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, there are various ways in which you can support it. You can donate directly at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below, or you can simply share, like, or comment on this podcast across social media. All your help is greatly appreciated. On that, and to talk us through the challenges of summit diplomacy with North Korea, this is Sean King. Sean King, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Great to be with you.
So let's talk through summit diplomacy, this fascinating issue that seems to be dominated North Korea, especially how it relates to the world, South Korea, and America. And it certainly has been the talk in everyone's tongue, especially with the end of the Hanoi summit recently. So as we begin to open this up, let's start at the beginning. Let's start in Singapore. So this summit was a jump in many ways. It went straight to high-level talks, and many people didn't expect it to happen quite as quickly. So I might get you to begin with some theory, just the conception of the idea of these sort of high-level summit talks. Do you see there's any value in them, at least in principle, or were they entirely misconceived and doomed to fail from the start?
Well, first of all, great to be with you on the program. I have a lot of respect for some of the other guests you've had on this program, like my good friend Stephen Nagy at International Christian University in Tokyo. And just a few disclaimers to start. I work at a firm called Park Strategies, which is run by former Senator U.S. D'Amato. But of course, my thoughts are mine and mine alone. Don't blame him for anything I say. And I don't speak Korean. I've never been to the DPRK, although I've stood at the DMZ and been to South Korea more times than I can remember. But I don't want to go to the north because I don't want to give the regime any of my tourist dollars. And the way things are going, they might not let me out based on some of the things I've said outside. But I did go to East Germany 4 times, and I've read a lot about North Korea and thought a lot about it. So please just take whatever I have to say and put it alongside whatever else you hear from people with PhDs who actually know something. I've always been concerned about U.S.-North Korea diplomacy because it would go around our South Korean ally. Remember, North Korea is an ultranationalist state that says it is the only legitimate Korean government for the entire peninsula, and that South Korea is an illegitimate colonial puppet of the United States that doesn't even have control over its own military. So we get sucked into these bilateral deals, and it delegitimizes the South. What made Singapore palatable for me was that the invitation came through South Korea. The South Korean team had gone to Pyongyang, then flown to Washington to brief the administration, and then came out there on the lawn of the West Wing and read out loud the invitation from Kim to Trump to meet. And, people said that this was like an Apprentice TV show like stunt that they did, and this was typical Trump showmanship. Maybe. I don't know what Trump's motives were. But I thought it was perfect because it showed that South Korea was front and center in our North Korea diplomacy, and that we weren't undercutting or going around our own ally. So from that point of view, I thought it was great. And intellectually, at least, I thought it was worth the try. So on paper, I was okay with the first summit.
And beyond paper, how it played out on the ground and how it ran through. So you mentioned there one of the great concerns in all these processes is the South Korean question, the idea of North Korea trying to bypass them in a way to claim an increased legitimacy here. So we will get to some much deeper questions about that a little later on, but let's move on to a question that did come out of the summit. It was openly discussed afterwards. A lot of people discussed it going into it. It seemed to be a very reasonable proposition, but one that I know you believe has a lot of hidden dangers inside it. It's the idea of a peace regime, this simple idea of why not. The war is over, clearly, despite not having an actual end of war declaration. So why can't these two countries just simply sign a peace declaration?
Well, is it over? I mean, North Korea has the 4th largest standing army in the world, most of which is forward deployed within miles of the DMZ. And last time I checked, they have not renounced their claim to South Korea's terra firma. And it was they who invaded the South. We now know from all the declassified Soviet and PRC archives. So who are we to give a reassurance to them? It should be the other way around. A lot of people called the Singapore Declaration vague. I didn't think it was vague at all. I thought it was very explicit, but on North Korean terms, especially the sequencing. I mean, just look at the 4 points. U.S. and DPRK will establish new DPRK relations. Peace regime, reaffirm the Pyongyang Declaration, and then the POW MIA remains. Nobody can argue with that. My heart goes out to those families, so God bless them. But this whole idea of a peace regime between the U.S. and North Korea, you cannot sign. That only gets us closer to a dreaded peace treaty, which worries me most of all, because you cannot sign a treaty with somebody with whom you do not have diplomatic relations. So for us to sign a peace treaty with North Korea, which a peace regime is a step toward, we would have to formally recognize North Korea. It would go against North Korea's own raison d'etre and constitution for it to recognize the South. So would we actually recognize North Korea without North Korea recognizing our ally? I mean, that's what this implies, and that's what worries me. We did establish economic diplomatic relations with East Germany in 1974, but that was only 2 years after the two Germanys recognized each other and sort of West Germany signed off on it. And this situation is much worse because East Germany never attacked West Germany. In fact, by the mid-'70s, East Germany had given up any hopes of unification and just saw itself as another socialist state that happened to be German. They wanted West Germany to be communist, just like the rest of the world, but they had no interest in German unification. So for us to talk about a peace regime that doesn't even in the declaration mention South Korea, that's very dangerous. And then this whole thing of complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. No matter how many times Mike Pompeo tries to convince himself otherwise on the U.S. talk shows, it doesn't mean North Korea's denuclearization. In North Korea language, which that is, it means an end of the U.S. nuclear umbrella of South Korea, maybe even of Japan too, an end of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, and then maybe North Korea would give up its nukes. Now, I never expected North Korea to give up its nukes anyway, but to go into this, get this kind of agreement and consider a success, I think is a complete misread of the situation.
So you did touch on something here that I think it points towards the importance of the issue in many ways. That was the MIA remains. This is the idea that North Korea, as part of this summit, were being, I suppose, the word you've been used out there, where they were generously returning the remains of U.S. Soldiers from the Korean War. But I'm not sure how you see this. I'm sure it's in slightly the way that I might as well. It's the idea that I'm not sure why this is even an issue, why it's even a question. It seems, I don't know many wars and many conflicts, no matter how heated they are around the world, where you don't automatically return the remains of soldiers. So how is that a concession, or do you not see it as a real concession at all?
I don't see it as a concession. I see it as a gain and some kind of closure and peace for families. And, it's not something I really like to talk about, because if it were my grandfather or my great uncle, I might be very happy about it. And, I don't really want to get into that too much because it shouldn't be a political football. But you're right. These things should have been settled a long time ago. And it tracks, it reminds me of North Korea's history of abductions, how they play games with human bodies and trade humans and abduct people for political gain. So the way that they've abducted South Koreans, Japanese, and even Europeans, it strikes me somewhat familiar that the way they're using the remains of these American heroes is a bargaining chip with the president. So it's kind of a subject I think is best left alone because it's so, sensitive. But yeah, you're right. This is something that should have been settled a long time ago.
And the other thing you mentioned there was the idea of complete denuclearization, and the idea that North Koreans see this quite differently than, I suppose, the West and countries like South Korea might as well. Now, is this difference between this difference in understanding, how do you see this playing out? Because is it something that is simply a misunderstanding? Are people inside the American State Department just not understanding that North Korea don't really mean denuclearization? They mean the removal of American nukes and American nuclear umbrella, or are they understanding that's what North Korea want, but they think that somehow they can edge the North Koreans closer to this? I mean, it seems like an easy to understand idea that North Korea are not as serious as they sound, or are not using the words in the same way that we are. But the talks went ahead anyway.
Right. Without trying to take a cheap shot at my own president, I genuinely think that he didn't really understand what that meant at the time of the summit. Just like only 6 months before this, he was talking to reporters, asking them if they knew that the Korean War never actually ended. I mean, he's starting from a very low level of knowledge on this issue. He's learned fast, but I think at the time of Singapore, he still really didn't get the nuance of the details. But John Bolton, I think, he's been a great reality check on this. And I get the sense that they are coming around on it because, depending on which story you believe out of Hanoi, the idea that Trump handed this Kim this piece of paper that said, complete denuclearization, ship your weapons, including chemical weapons, to the U.S. for dismantlement, then you'll get economic goodies. That may not be practical, but at least it reassures me that Trump is now seeing denuclearization of North Korea as we should be seeing it, not the way North Korea sees it. So I think that people in the State Department, the problem with Singapore was it was all top-down, personality-driven. Steve Biegun didn't have much of a role, if any. And Trump was just kind of winging it. But now that the professionals are involved and you got somebody like Bolton around who has the battle scars from, 2002 and the George W. Bush era, I think it's put the brakes on this. So I think the administration is coming around on what this actually means.
And as we move in, let's open up the topic and the issue of Trump a bit more. But through that, one last thing from Singapore was this almost afterthought. It seemed like an afterthought from Donald Trump as he was leaving a private meeting between him and Kim. He comes out and he says, we're going to end war games. Now, I call them war games only because Trump did there. They are, in many ways, these ideas of increasing military preparedness. They are exercises. But Trump came out and he used the North Korean language. He called them these provocative war games. So, how do you see this? It sings in many ways like a sort of Putin style dilemma. You get Trump in a room with someone else and you don't know how easily he can be swayed either way or whether he realizes he is.
Yeah, I was outraged when I heard that. And I'd been awake at 33 hours by the time of the press conference because I had actually been in Singapore that weekend and left right before the summit started. So I was running on fumes. But I couldn't believe it. At least he's consistent. I mean, as long as he was signing off to North Korean language in the declaration, at least he used it in his speech too. I mean, for a U.S. president to label U.S. military exercises as provocative war games, I mean, it just makes you think. And I thought that was a huge concession, obviously a great concern to Japan, because if we wind down and pull out of South Korea one day, which Trump himself has said he wants to do because of the cost, Japan has to think they're the only one with major U.S. bases left in Asia. They could be next, and then they're sitting ducks for China, and then, of course, Taiwan, but that's another story. So, people say we can put the exercises back on, but if we do, now we look like the aggressor. So we gave something away without getting anything in return proactively, and we look like the bad guy if we go back to normal, which is just, again, defending South Korea because North Korea's violated the armistice several times and started the war in the first place. And, the troops rotate in and out pretty much every year. So pretty soon you're going to have the majority of troops there in South Korea who have never done exercises with their South Korean counterparts. Now, I've heard references, people saying, well, maybe you could restart the exercises, but have them somewhere else in a third country or maybe even Hawaii so it doesn't upset North Korea. As the Ewoks showed in Return of the Jedi, knowing your territory is a great advantage over a stronger, bigger foe. So any war would be on South Korean terrain. So for the exercises to be effective, it has to be held in South Korea. So as bad as the declaration was, Trump's own language on the military exercises may have been the worst thing of all to come out of Singapore.
But Trump did claim one victory, and he claimed it going into the summit, and he claimed it coming out of the summit, and that was the idea that North Korea are no longer testing. So if people with short memories, they might have forgotten, but in the year of 2007, 2017 was all about nuclear tests and missile tests. It ratcheted all the way through, and then suddenly at the very start of 2018, we had the current peace détente that we have now rolling through. So Trump has claimed that as a victory. So this speaks a lot in some ways to misunderstandings of how missile cycles are tested, the testing processes, and then maybe also the nature of the nuclear sites in which North Korea tests and how ready or available they are, if ever again, for more testing. So why is that not the issue that Trump thinks it is? Why is this not a victory?
Well, it's not a loss. I wouldn't say that's insignificant, but I just don't know if it's as much as he's making it out to be, because if you go back to the previous decade, there have been similar stretches of time, almost similar stretches of time where North Korea did not test a missile or a nuke, and their program was nonetheless racing ahead. I mean, does anybody remember the last time that Pakistan tested a missile or a nuke? Doesn't mean that their nuclear program is going away. And other intelligence suggests that the North Korea nuclear program is actually in mass production and that they don't have to test it anymore because they know it works. And, they're mass producing it anyway. I don't want to discount that, but I just don't think that's worth so much that we've given away in terms of military exercises, the face we've given Kim, and also the fact that Trump has to say he's in love with him and that he's his good friend. I mean, the guy's a tyrant and killer. He kills his family members. He has hundreds of thousands of his own citizens in gulags, and he denies his own people most basic rights. And then in Hanoi, he goes and says he takes Kim Jong-un's word on that he didn't have anything to do with Otto Warmbier's death. I just don't think of all that is worth just no testing. It's good, but it's not enough.
So what is Trump getting out of this, at least in his mind? Because he's incredibly willing to turn up to these summits. He hasn't ruled out future summits coming up at some point. So what is he getting out of this? Is this just a vain exercise, or is he in some ways looking to be the person that fixes this impossible issue in your mind?
Could be all of the above. You got to have a great sense of ego to be in that position anyway, to run for president in the first place. But he is obsessed with showing he can do things that previous presidents did not, whether it's on trade, whether it's on dealing with China. This is the perfect issue because it's not enough for him to say, I'm doing this. He's got to put down previous U.S. presidents by name, which he has a tendency to do while abroad, which is really unsettling as an American. But I think he thinks he can figure it out and have this personal connection with Kim and do something no one else has done, and then have an excuse and a reason to bring U.S. troops home from South Korea, which I think is his ultimate goal, which is something he's been talking about since the 1980s when he was just a private citizen. So I think he thinks he's different. He can do it and save the U.S. a lot of money in the process, and maybe even get a Nobel Peace Prize to boot. And if he does succeed in North Korea denuclearization, he deserves one. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's his fault. Remember, North Korea is the aggressor here. Their nuclear program has been afoot since the 1960s. I don't blame Donald Trump for this. I just don't think he's going to solve it in a few summits.
So if that is something that he's seeking there, what do you make of his overall policy towards this idea? Because in some ways you can criticize the person of Trump a lot, but his policy has gotten, I suppose, in many ways, a mixed view here. This idea of maximum pressure. People say this is what brought the North Koreans to the table. I'm not sure how you see that. I'll get you to expand that in a second. But there's also the question of pushing this maximum pressure on North Korea, while at the same time signaling to the region that perhaps America are cutting and running the idea of leaving the TPP, and also ideas that pushing out there in the world that our allies need to pay more for these troops, and it's not a great idea to have our foreign troops abroad. Now, this isn't a one-off thought by Trump, this last one. This is something he's been rattling on for years, the idea of how expensive it is to have our troops abroad. So, what do you make of his overall policy directions here?
I'd say it's mixed, because I wouldn't say it was ever maximum pressure, because we never really went after the primarily mainland Chinese handlers of North Korea's cash. I mean, North Korea is a multinational criminal enterprise, and you have to follow the money. And the mostly PRC banks that handle North Korea's payments, they use dollars, which means they have correspondent bank accounts onshore in the United States to complete these trades. And Treasury knows who these banks are. All of these banks should have their U.S. correspondent bank accounts suspended immediately, so long as they continue to do trade with North Korea. But except for one or two instances, Trump has refused to use this leverage, and I can't understand why. So to me, that would be maximum pressure. And since the Singapore summit, Beijing and Moscow have found now an excuse to sort of puncture and go around the sanctions. And of course, Seoul is looking for any reason to reopen Kaesong, Mount Kumgang, this railway project, and send as much money north without any concessions on human rights, the way, say, West Germany would give loan guarantees to East Germany, but always demand exit visas for East Germans or other human rights concessions in return. South Korea just likes to, at least the nationalist left Moon Jae-in government seems to just want to write blank checks to the North without anything in return. And like you said, there was this threat of a bloody nose. I don't know how real that was. That could have been just mind games we were playing with Kim. But at the same time, we've also retreated from Asia in a number of ways. I mean, there's the whole idea of making South Korea pay more And now the 5-year SMA, this deal under which we base troops in South Korea, was 5 years. Now it's 1 year. It's sort of become now an annual protection racket. And that's always hanging over their heads. And maybe North Korea can exploit that. Leaving TPP, it showed that in terms of trade and economics, we're turning over Asia to China. But in other ways, we have increased the freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea. Trump has been the best president in recent memory on Taiwan. He's done a lot of things no other president's done. I give him full credit for that. And we do seem to be getting serious on a South Pacific strategy and the second island chain. So I give him, maybe a B minus. I just don't like this idea of saying what a great guy Kim is, suspending exercises, threatening to pull out of South Korea, and giving Kim as much face as he's given him. But, we'll see what happens.
So let's push forward here onto, in what is my view, and I think it's yours as well, but I get you to open this up, the idea of the ideology inside North Korea and in some ways inside South Korea. Now, ideology is one of those issues that seems to pass most people by, that we imagine in our world these days that people are simply motivated by what comes before them, that are all just reactionary. And the idea of someone holding a deep, ingrained ideology that defines everything else that they see in the world is something that most people just can't tend to fathom. And so we miss a lot of threats in the world, and we misunderstand threats in the world. So let's open this up in some detail, but just I might get you to begin with the idea that the words that came out of Moon Jae-in, this is the South Korean president's mouth, and this is a not just from him, previous presidents have said this as well, but the idea that inside South Korea, he celebrates, and many South Koreans do as well, the founding of their republic in 1919 rather than 1948. So this is a deep issue, but I might get to start, and then we'll begin to roll it deeper from there.
Yeah, and I wonder if anybody in the Trump administration was aware of this, that Moon Jae-in had declared March 1st, 1919 as the founding of the Republic of Korea, not 1948, when they agreed to have the Hanoi summit on February 28th. Because going into Hanoi, I was very nervous that Trump might offer some kind of peace declaration or even a troop withdrawal from the South, which then Kim could come home as the conquering hero to Pyongyang on the same day that Moon Jae-in is celebrating 100th anniversary of the Republic of Korea in Seoul. Thankfully, it didn't turn out that way because Hanoi wasn't as bad as I feared, but that's always in the background. I was a child of the Cold War. I went to East Germany 4 times in 1980s. I first visited the DMZ in 1997. And really for a while, I just saw North Korea as a Korean version of East Germany. But it's in fact a ultra nationalist, really far right Korean state that sees itself as the defenders of the racially pure and innocent Korean people. And it's inner propaganda is much worse than the stuff we see, where it openly decries South Korea for allowing foreigners on their soil and for tolerating things like intermarriage and an openness to foreigners. And, they rewrote the Kim family history to say that Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, was born on Mount Paektu, the holy mountain of Korea, so that they could draw a direct bloodline to the ancient Korean God King Dong-un, trying to say that they're almost like holy descendants of Korean gods, and that without the Kim family, Korea as a whole is defenseless, and you need these people to protect innocent, virtuous Korea from the outside world and all these dangerous foreigners. Even this false idea of Juche, which is a total scam because they've been playing off the world for all kinds of aid as long as they've been around. This idea of independence, or we can do it alone. We don't need foreigners. There were no Chinese troops in North Korea after the Korean War, even though it was China who bailed them out. And look at the South Koreans. They're not real Koreans because they don't control their own army and they allow foreigners on their soil. This is another reason why South Korea doesn't really have to worry about the North Korean nuclear threat, because Kim is on record saying he would never nuke the South because he considers the Republic of Korea territory his own. So he wouldn't spread nuclear fallout on his own people and his own earth. So we have to stop thinking of North Korea as a communist regime and think of it as an ultra-nationalist Korean regime that wants all foreign influence off the peninsula so that the true descendants of the God King can rule over it. And that means America out and some kind of confederation or unification under Kim's watchful eye. this is not stuff I'm making up. This is stuff that's out there. If you just choose to, if you read North Korea's own propaganda, it's out there in black and white.
And that would also indicate, and this is something that many people out there don't take seriously, the motivating factor inside North Korean minds, or at least inside the regime, and then feeding down to the people, the idea of the need to reunify. If you have this idea that you are in fact a pure race, well, you have another half of your pure race next to you that you are not part of. So when North Korea speak about the final victory, they speak about conquering the South and reunifying the people. So let's turn this to South Korea a little bit here for a second. South Koreans tend to speak the same language. And that is why that 1919 declaration is such a problem, I suppose. It is that in some ways, South Korea are playing the exact same game that the North are playing, just on a slightly different register, slightly softer. And in some ways, this can be seen, if you accept this, this can be seen to be encouraging the behavior of the North. They become more and more stuck in their ways, more and more rigorous, more and more intense in the sense that what they can never do is become less than the South. They can never allow themselves to be less homogenous, less nationalistic, less racially pure than the South, because someday it'll come down to a challenge between the two, and both believe in that one idea of a racially pure society.
Yeah, who's more Korean? Well, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be unified. I mean, Ireland, in theory, would want to be unified. Germany did too. Sudan. So, it's not, wanting to be unified is not necessarily a racial motivation, but we have to realize that North Korea's motivation is nationalistic, and it's not economic, or it's not communist. And South Korea is so unusual because it's one of the few, if only, major nation state of which I know where its political left is more nationalistic than its political right. North Korea and then the South, the liberals would accuse people like Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak of not being Korean enough, because Lee Myung-bak was born in Osaka and Park Geun-hye's father, collaborated with Japan. And, conservatives, they just take their orders from Tokyo and Washington. They're not real Koreans. And Syngman Rhee was a U.S. English-speaking puppet. So, there's always this thing that North Korea is trying to drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States. Well, it could be that South Korea is doing that for them in this case, because they seem to be making a lot of excuses for the North, and they could have a willing partner in Donald Trump, and that's somebody who wants to exit from Northeast Asia. So did Kim come to the table because of the sanctions and the threats? Maybe. Or did he come to the table because in his mind, he has a perfect storm? He has a politically sympathetic leadership in Seoul with an American president who's looking for a reason to leave. And now he has a nuclear deterrent that actually works. Not a deterrent against regime change, because if we were serious about regime change I hope we still support regime change in a peaceful economic manner, because that's really the only way this gets resolved. But if we had any sense of invading North Korea, we would have done it before they had the nukes. The fact that the conventional threat to Seoul is so great, we couldn't have responsibly attempted any kind of decapitation strike in the first place. So I never considered that a real issue. And certainly now with the nukes, we never would. But I do think that having the nukes gives North Korea the ability to wear down South Korea's resistance, so that if they were to coerce the South or force some kind of confederation or unification, or heaven forbid, invade a second time, we have our treaty obligations to the South, but is San Francisco really worth Seoul? I don't know. I assume Donald Trump would defend South Korea, but maybe a future president wouldn't. Who knows? But it puts that doubt in our mind. It puts that space between South Korea and the United States. And I think that's North Korea's ultimate goal. Again, only going on what they said.
And another aspect of this coming in at this point needs to be the idea of how North Korea see America in this game of race-based nationalism that they have there. And this is the idea of Songun in many ways, of military-first policy. And their look at America, at least how they portrayed this inside their own country and how they have portrayed South Korea, is that the Americans are this vampiric outside force that are coming to get this pure race, this pure Korean race. And they've done so to the South. And so the South are this puppet regime here. Now, this view of America seems to, if you were taking them seriously at their word, and you can't not if they are in fact telling their own people this every single day. If you take this view seriously, then it implies it's going to be very hard to talk to someone out there when they are making up such a story about you, but also saying that you are and this is a quote, I suppose, the race enemy.
Yes. And unfortunately, there are some people in the South Korean left who identify with this and sort of cut North Korea slack and have some respect for it. This is one reason why I was so disappointed that Moon Jae-in went to Mount Baekdu with Kim Jong-un. He was sort of buying into this myth of the Kim monarchy and the Kim dynasty connected to ancient Korean god King Dong-un. And, North Korea repeatedly lies to its own people, telling them that we, these impure Americans, were the ones who invaded North Korea, when it was in June of 1949 that we withdrew our troops and left behind 500 advisors. And then when we said that South Korea is not really in our sphere of influence, after badgering Stalin for years, Kim finally got the go-ahead. Now, what he told Mao and what he told him to get the reassurance from Mao about bailing him out, who really knows? But the fact is, North Korea invaded the South after we left, yet they lied to their own people that we invaded them, and they defended the country, even though it was China who bailed them out. So I think if you're dealing with somebody who's in such an alternate reality, who says we Americans are inherently evil, I really don't see how you come to an agreement. I mean, it's worth talking, but you're really handicapped to begin with.
And if North Korea never get around to a second invasion of the South for whatever reason, let's hope that never happens, there is another risk in all of this. And that is the idea of a low-level confederation, the idea that, and this is happening right before our eyes, at least very slowly, the idea of economic cooperation and trade and integrating banks and policies and railroads, etc. Now, once you begin to integrate this, there is a long-term risk to South Korea down the line, and it comes directly from that idea of a race-based nationalism. So I might get you to open that up, because people might immediately think there will never be another war, and in many ways it seems unlikely, but it doesn't have to come to that for the South Korean state, South Korean Republic, to be in danger here.
Yeah, there might not have to be another war, because already Moon's party has tried to push forth the confederation, but there was enough of a conservative opposition in the assembly to stop it, and we'll see who wins the next presidential election. But if you have, these economic projects and enough of this talk, a low-level confederation, and a U.S. president who's really not interested in defending the South and is looking for a reason to leave and save money, and nukes is a counter threat against this, then you may just see eventually South Korea drift North Korea's way. I think if North Korea opens up, it falls. So we'll have to see. But, I really I'm not convinced South Korea fully wants to defend itself in the long term, or at least not the people who are in charge right now.
And as a final point here, I have to mention this just because people always do. So I might mention this in hope that you will shoot it down quickly before my eyes here. This question here of South Korea is a risk to, as a wealthy, prosperous nation, it is a risk to North Korea. And people always say, well, Taiwan is not a risk to China in terms of ideology. So I might get you to break down what the differences are here, because they seem to be quite common, but this is also an incredibly common question people always say, at least when they're trying to shoot down the idea of this sort of nationalist impulse inside Korea.
Well, I would see it as this. I mean, this gets me to economic liberalization. And again, I think Trump totally misread this. And, we can get into Vietnam being the summit location second time around, saying that Vietnam was a model for North Korea. It was, but maybe not the model we want to follow. I mean, again, North Korea is an ultranationalist, homogeneous state that bills itself as the only legitimate Korea. If it opens up and lets people see what's out there, they'll see a much wealthier, larger, almost equally homogeneous state in South Korea. Then what reason does the Kim regime have to exist? Mainland China could open up in 1979 because by then, even before its reform, its economy was 5 times the size of Taiwan, and many governments, including Canada, the UK, Japan, the US had already switched its diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing as the one China, and it also had regained the Chinese seat in the UN. Vietnam could afford to open up once US troops had left and had its own unification. So I think economic liberalization is a threat to the North Korean regime, which is why I don't think they'll ever really open up. North Korea, as we know it, cannot afford economic development.
So let's go with you there, actually. So let's leave behind the race issue for a second and move towards the Hanoi summit and how it moves forward. But let's make a little interdiction in the meanwhile and touch on the economic question, and I suppose also the question of sanctions. So as you mentioned there, it is in many ways it's one of those issues that people fall on different sides of. They think North Korea desperately want to open up and develop in terms of the Chinese or Vietnam model. And as you mentioned there, you don't believe that it's possible, at least not possible without the regime collapse. And so what is the value then in your mind about sanctions? So this is many people say that this is what brought North Korea to the table this time. These really strictly imposed sanctions. So how do you see the place of sanctions in all of this?
I think it should be number 1, 2, and 3 in terms of priority. And I think it's a very peacefully effective way to bring about real change. I watch a lot of ice hockey, and I remember in 1999, the star of the Dallas Stars, Mike Modano, was caught by the other team, the Buffalo Sabres, injecting a freezing painkiller into his wrist in between shifts. And he had denied any injury, but when they saw that, the Buffalo Sabres knew he had a broken wrist. So what did? They hit his wrist the next time out. Kim Jong-un basically did the same thing in Vietnam. I thought he was going to lead with a request for a peace declaration or some kind of troops withdrawal. The fact that he was so open about sanctions relief tells me that the sanctions are really getting to him, and he has problems, which is good news. So if anything, we should double up the sanctions and really go after the PRC banks handling his cash, because North Korea is a criminal enterprise. It needs the money to keep the elites happy, to keep buying things like fuel, keep the country running, and to also acquire parts for its weapons program. So I think if we attack its sources of cash and really get serious about, really like medieval draconian sanctions, everything, I think it's worth a try to see if we can bring the regime to heel. So I think sort of like, I've used this analogy. If you have a drug gang in New York City and they suddenly run into New Jersey, you don't stop. You go into New Jersey and look for them. So we need to smoke them out the world over and dry up all their cash and try to put them out of business. I really think that's the best way out of this in a peaceful way.
But of course, part of that smoking out involves, should involve, I suppose, the idea of secondary sanctions, which are a bit more challenging. But this was part of maximum pressure, at least as Rex Tillerson saw it. This idea that anyone that tries to break North Korean sanctions, we target. And you've written something that many people might find a little controversial, though it runs on the exact same logic, but it makes people a little bit more nervous. The idea that America in this regard should be imposing strict secondary sanctions on China, because they are, of course, North Korea's largest trading partner, but also in many ways the largest violator of sanctions.
Yeah, it shouldn't be that controversial because they're using mostly U.S. dollars. That's our money. Those are promissory notes from the U.S. government. We should have a right to say who uses our money and to trade in dollars, as so many despots apparently do, even though they hate us in theory. You have to settle your trades onshore in a U.S. bank. So all these Chinese banks that handle Kim's money have U.S. onshore correspondent bank accounts, and they're using our money against our laws. It's really only enforcing our own anti-money laundering laws. And it's our obligation, really, to cut off these trades if we know they're happening. So it's not like we're intervening in the European Central Bank or telling London what to do with pound sterling. We're just saying who gets to use our dollars and who doesn't. And if we know that these Chinese banks are handling Kim's dollar payments, and we do apparently, then we should cut them off. I think that's totally within our sovereign right to do.
And what should we expect from these sanctions? People often just say, let's sanction someone because it's a nice alternative to warfare. But of course, there must be a very serious intention behind some long-term goal that we're trying to achieve here. So is it, in your view, possible to sanction North Korea towards denuclearization? So when we apply enough pain over time to not just to Kim, but the Kim regime and even people lower down the country, that they will begin to recognize the change and change themselves? Or would it be more beneficial to simply hope that this might bring about itself regime change?
I don't know, but we have to try it. My hope would be that it brings about regime change, because I don't think Kim will or can give up his nukes based on the corner into which he's painted himself. If he does, great, but I really don't think he will. I mean, after all, it's in the Constitution. He's invested so much in it. So my ultimate goal would be peaceful regime change through economic strangulation. And people who say sanctions don't work, I mean, look at South Africa. I mean, sanctions brought down apartheid along with resistance from the black masses. Sanctions had a tremendous effect in Myanmar until recently, because, China stepped in to fill the void, and Aung San Suu Kyi has disappointed us all with her ethnic cleansing. But for a while there, it really worked. Economic ineptitude and being closed off from the world system is what helped bring down the Soviet Union and world communism. So sanctions can work when they're concerted and when they're followed through. And I think we really have to once and for all give it the good old college try in North Korea and go whole hog on sanctions and see how far we can go. And my ultimate goal for the Korean people, so that they can live as one peacefully as they deserve, would be regime change and an end to the Kim nightmare.
So let's jump into the Hanoi summit in full flow here. So I might get you to introduce just quickly what happened, what was offered, and what wasn't. But I suppose more importantly, how serious you think Kim Jong-un was in what he offered. So he offered a form, though I might get to expand on this, a form of denuclearization, at least as he called it. And in return, he was seeking a very substantial form of sanctions relief. So was it a genuine offer, do you believe? Or how do you see the actual offer and then the breakdown of the offer?
Well, as for Yongbyon, I have heard conflicting stories, whether or not it was for the plutonium, the uranium, or both. I heard one account that they offered just the plutonium. Then when we balked, Foreign Minister Ri said, then they threw in uranium. I mean, I really don't know. I feel like we've been down this road before with Yongbyon. I thought it was destroyed in 2008. But apparently, we are aware of the other facilities around the DPRK, including some other secret uranium enrichment sites. And I could tell with the minimum of fanfare that Trump seemed very confident in our intelligence and what we knew. So that gave me some comfort that we seem to know what's really going on there, and that Yongbyon was far from enough. And again, the fact that Kim was so desperate for sanctions relief really showed me that he's hurting and that we're getting somewhere on the so-called moderate pressure. So I went into Hanoi fearing the worst for the political reasons that I've stated, like a peace regime or a troop withdrawal. But I came out feeling pretty good. It seems like Trump's finally coming around to my view, or our view, of what North Korea denuclearization is. And then these stories since then that he handed them this letter or this sheet of paper, thanks to John Bolton, saying, Libya-style model, full denuclearization, and then we'll open up. It's probably not practical, but again, it gives me confidence that Trump's on the right path. He's seeing the problem for what it is. So I was very impressed that Trump walked away from Hanoi. Again, I was very disappointed that he took Kim's word on Otto Warmbier's death. That would have slapped him in the face to Otto's parents. But all in all, Hanoi could have been much worse. And I think it gives us something to work with going forward. At least now we know where Kim is hurting.
So was Kim hoping just to play that kind of Putin game, or what he may have got a sense from the first time around, that if I can just get Trump alone in a room, then maybe I can get Trump to give me something that is entirely unreasonable, but Trump can maybe even sell back to his country, and therefore Kim can win a game of language in many ways.
Yeah, you notice the attacks from Madam Che and others in KCNA since Hanoi have targeted Pompeo and Bolton by name, but they always go out of their way to say, but Chairman Kim still has a good relationship with President Trump. I think that Kim's idea was ignore the staff, talk to Began, be nice to him, cut out Pompeo, and then get Trump alone, give him a deal that he can't refuse, and give him an excuse to get out of South Korea or claim this great success. Now, I don't know if that's because Bolton was always with him, but it wasn't going to work like it did last time in Singapore. So I give Trump credit for sticking to his game, and I think Kim has to recalibrate, and maybe he underestimated Team Trump going into Hanoi.
And for many people listening, I might get to open up. What do you think that the American side actually wants from this? Because once again, this is a game of language in many ways. But when Americans and the world look at North Korea and say, we want denuclearization, in many ways, the standard model is you let inspectors in, they look at your sites, they collate your missiles, they collate what you can do, where you can. Is this exactly the same model? Is this what the Americans are hoping for? Or are they hoping that North Korea will simply make their own accounting of such weapons and maybe make their own removal of such weapons and testing facilities?
Well, we have to be careful when we say the Americans, because sometimes in the Trump era, I feel we're dealing with parallel administrations. You could have a State Department and National Security Council that does one thing to a foreign adversary, and then Trump comes in the room and says, no, that's not it at all. I mean, we saw this 2 weeks ago with Treasury announcing the new sanctions on the Chinese shipping companies. Then Trump tweets the next day, no, it's not going to happen. Now, there have been so many back and forth of what that really was about. But obviously, Trump is not always on the same page as is other officials in the administration. But I think the operating American definition of denuclearization would be that inspectors come in, North Korea takes down its nuclear weapons program, and everything is accounted for. And we have, or at least the IAEA or some international body, maybe send Sweden or Switzerland in there, has full access to North Korea to make sure that it's taken down. But that's the functioning definition of denuclearization in the American body politic. Now, what Trump actually thinks, I don't know. He may say, and when he came back from Singapore, Trump tweeted that the North Korean nuclear threat is gone, is no longer. Now, everybody laughed at him for that, and as did I. But the more I think about it, he may have been being honest there in the sense that he may have been saying that the North Korean nuclear threat to the United States, he could have, in that secret meeting with Kim, said a thing where if you take down the ICBMs, I'll move toward bringing U.S. troops out of South Korea. I know you're not going to nuke South Korea. Japan's on its own, but we'll worry about that later. So in Trump's mind, it could be just protecting America from the North Korean nuclear threat is denuclearization. But I think based on what happened at Hanoi and what he said since, I think he's coming around to our general definition of denuclearization, in that North Korea commits to unilaterally giving up its nuclear program, and that we go in there with inspectors to verify it. Now, that may sound like a pipe dream. It's what's some called the Libya model, but I think that's what most Americans still think of when they think of denuclearization.
Now, you just mentioned Japan there. So let's introduce the idea of a region-wide moral hazard from any sort of denuclearization or reduction of missile technology deal, if in fact we can ever achieve this in the future. So I've heard you mention before, and I've seen it in your writing as well, that this can be a huge challenge for the region. So just imagine a wonderful scenario for America where they perhaps, or even for other countries in the region, where North Korea agreed to limit their long-term development of long-range nuclear missiles, for example. Now, this seems like a wonderful victory for of course, the American administration, but this leaves a country like Japan incredibly vulnerable. And they're vulnerable in a way where suddenly they are forced to reckon with their own stability and their own military defense. So and then of course it opens up a weakness that other countries will see, countries like China, for example. So I might yet open up the challenges involved in that sort of moral hazard, sort of making a deal that suits an American an American administration, but maybe long-term damages the region as a whole.
Yeah, that would be the worst of all worlds for, say, Japan, which is, the vanguard of the U.S. alliance system in Asia. They, ideally for Japan, they get denuclearization in North Korea as we define it. And then second best would be status quo. But the worst would be this in-between where America gets denuclearization for itself in its own territory. But there's this gray area middle ground where the region has to fend for itself. So that would be the worst of all worlds. And that would then, of course, suggests some kind of U.S. troop withdrawal from South Korea. And that's 28,500 fewer troops in the area were China ever to move on Japan's Senkaku Islands and or Taiwan. So Japan would see itself as sort of defending the American ideal in Asia without America there anymore if that were to come to pass. So I think that was Abe's real fear going into Hanoi. And he had his diplomats running around outside our hotel in Hanoi trying to get little breadcrumbs of what we were discussing, because there's always been this sense, fear and soul of Korea passing, that US, Japan, China, and Russia would negotiate and solve Korea's problems around Seoul. I think now in Tokyo, you have a fear of Japan passing. Trump doesn't, even though, Abe made him very nice baseball hats when he went to Japan in 2017 and bought him a golf club, he doesn't really seem to talk to Abe much these days. It seems to be like Moon is his guy to go to, even though they're not always on the same page. So I think Japan feels like the odd man out here, and they would have to really think about their role. Maybe they would have to cut some kind of long-term deal with China, because their real fear is China, not North Korea. Although North Korea is a existential threat in itself. I mean, the real fear for China is for Japan is Beijing long-term. There's talk of Japan going nuclear. I just don't see it as the only country. I mean, look at just reinterpreting Article 9 that brought the country to a standstill. They had so much trouble with that just in collective self-defense. I couldn't imagine them going nuclear as the only country to ever have suffered a nuclear attack. So I don't think we're there yet. But any kind of halfway deal, as Trump has maybe suggested in the past, would really leave Japan out in the cold. And they would be very unsettled, as would all of Asia, as would Taiwan.
And as these summit talks actually take place, there is a large acceptance out there in the media. Now, we touched on this slightly earlier in terms of the idea of North Korean nationalism, but there's an acceptance out there that North Korea are an insecure state, that they are gaining these nuclear weapons because they are fearful of outside intervention, and they are genuinely concerned about their own defense. Now, that comes in some ways from the referencing that people do about the Libyan model, of course, but many people out there would see this differently. They might say that this has never been the issue here because they've always had an incredibly strong deterrent anyway. And this, of course, goes to South Korea's alliance with America. That is, right. If 20 years ago we wanted to knock off the regime, we could have done so before they had nuclear weapons, and we chose not to. And you have to assume that we chose not to, not for a significant number of reasons, but also for the huge amount of life that would be lost in South Korea by North Korean conventional artillery.
Right. So I think the greatest threat to the North Korean regime is the North Korean people, which is why I don't think they can afford to open up economically, because once the North Korean people see what's been done to them for 70 years, the hell through which they've had to live while other people have developed while they haven't, they're going to want answers from the Kim dynasty. So I think the greatest threat to the North Korean regime is its own people. And exactly like you said, if we were serious about regime change, we would have done it before the nuclear program took hold. But like you said, you have the fourth largest standing army in the world, 8,000 artillery pieces trained on Seoul. You'd have hundreds of, even if we would win any conflict with North Korea, which I'm convinced we would, you'd have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dead innocent South Koreans, and we just can't risk it. So we are not the threat to North Korea. The threat to North Korea is its own system and its own people.
So on that is a great little summation, that line of yours, that the greatest, that their regime threat is from their own people. So it brings a thought to my mind as you're saying that perhaps it might be a much more simple way, though, of course, I'm not sure how naive I'm being here, but it might be a much easier way and a test of this theory that North Korea are a race-based nationalist country, that instead of seeking these grand gestures of denuclearization, which might be hard, how about seeking a simple reduction in rhetoric? So, for example, if North Korea, if you simply ask North Korea, please stop referring to America as the race enemy, please stop referring to South Korea as the puppet regime. In fact, start saying the opposite. It costs them basically zero, except for ideological points, and it only costs them something, which of course might be significant, if in fact they are in that mindset, that race-based mindset. In which case, there can never be talks in the first place. Or
how about allowing in some media, some foreign information? let North Koreans at least watch Chinese TV, which they can't. When East and West Germany reached out to each other and they established diplomatic relations, one of the requirements was that East Germany had to stop jamming West German TV. So East Germans learned about their government by watching West German news. Had traveled, some limited travel back and forth, and West Germans were allowed to visit East Germany, and a few 100,000 East Germans were allowed to go west each year on the condition that they left a family member home as ransom. There's no contact at all between North and South. Media, what is North Korea afraid of? I mean, we watch North Korean media kind of as a joke, but nobody reads some South Korean books. And I am disappointed when South Korea turns off the loudspeakers of the DMZ and stops those balloons across the border, as if the people sending the balloons, not what you think. It wasn't the promise of riches or food that drew her. It was that she couldn't believe in a South Korean newspaper you could criticize the South Korean government. And when she saw that, it made her believe everything else she had seen about the South. And she said, wow, I want to live in a country where I can criticize my own leaders. How confident North Korea really is. Let's see.
So from that, let's look forward for how this might develop inside the future. I know these questions are speculative, hypothetical, and in that way they are challenging and in some ways also uncomfortable. But the first one, let's talk about South Korea and North Korea, Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, and how you think that this might continue into the future. Because the great criticism out there, and we touched on it a lot already, is that Moon Jae-in, despite not getting an agreement on denuclearization, has simply moved ahead with the cooperation and the kindness and the outreach and the relief anyway. So do you see this continuing, and do you see it hitting a wall at any point soon, or do you think that this movement between the two Koreas is simply just going to run forward and run on this way for a number of years?
I think that the rhetoric, the warmth, the bonhomie between Kim and Moon will continue unabated. That's just who Moon is. He doesn't have to worry about running for a second term. So he's going to keep it up. But whether or not he could get clearance to move ahead with projects like the railway program, Mount Kumgang, Kaesong, hopefully we put the kibosh on that, because that would be a clear sanctions violation. So he's going to be saying all these nice things and continuing to cover for Kim to Trump. But in real dollar terms, I don't really know how much he can get away with if we don't sign off on it. I think Trump is sort of like over the love affair romance of it all. He's seeing things a lot more clearly and coldly. And you have to remember, we're entering election season in the U.S. And depending on who his Democratic opponent is, he won't want to be seen as too soft or too weak on Kim Jong-un. And I expect Kim Jong-un in the meantime probably to go back to see Xi Jinping again, and also maybe make a first trip to Moscow. He should go to Russia. After all, that's where his father was born, no matter what North Korea propaganda says. So you expect to see North Korea reach out to its old friends, continue to lean on Moon. Hopefully Trump keeps driving a hard bargain. But he said, Pompeo said this week he wants a third summit. So I get nervous whenever Kim and Trump meet, because I don't know what's going to happen if Kim and Trump are alone in a room, just like we still don't know what Trump and Putin said to each other in Helsinki. And Moon is coming here next week. So it seems like Moon is really desperate to do anything. I'd love to be on a fly on the wall between Kim and Moon and Trump, almost as much as I like to hear what Kim and Trump have to say to each other.
And I'll ask you an absolutely impossible question here. I might take you inside the mind of Kim Jong-un. As you mentioned, he may be reaching out for summits with some allies, Russia and China. But what do you think his next play is from here, if you're going to try and take a few steps in his shoes, based on everything we've said so far and what his long-term goals probably are? What do you think his next steps are?
I think he would make Trump a slightly sweeter offer than he did in Hanoi. Not go all the way, maybe nothing that demonstrably changes his long-term nuclear capability, but try to give Trump something more so he can at least get and ask for something else. So maybe offer Trump a little more, be a little more explicit on what he's willing to give up, and then maybe ask for some sanctions relief, not all sanctions relief, as he did, depending on which story you buy. But hopefully Trump stands firm. And hopefully by then our sanctions are much tougher anyway. So his benchmark is, it's a much higher pain threshold to begin with. So, we're dealing with two unusual characters in Kim and Trump. I don't think Kim is irrational at all. I think much of his behavior is predictable. He's evil and diabolical, but he's, a rational player. You never know which way Trump is going to go, but I would expect Kim to make a slightly sweeter offer and ask for just a little less. But I hope Trump holds his ground and in the meantime increases the sanctions.
So we'll wait and see how it all plays out. So this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, Sean. I really enjoyed it. Now, I know below there's a lot that we didn't get to, so I'm going to link below this podcast for people listening to read and to watch videos previously that Sean has done on the topic and related topics. I encourage you to go to have a look. They will be tagged below in this podcast. So on that, Sean King, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
My pleasure, Jed. Good to be with you.